Cool. So the recording's on now, guys. And I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Great. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen there. And I'm just going to, so what you'll see is the Leo page. And so you know, we're all connecting, well, we're all connecting here anyway through the video conferences, which is great. Hopefully you're following along through the content and the tutorial activities as well. So basically, you would have seen the email late last week about hopefully everyone, or the vast majority of you guys would have completed Research Methodology 1 and 2 tutorials, online tutorials by now. So Research Methodology 1 was on there before the online only changes were made to Research and Ethics. We've had the Research Methodology 2 tutorial up since the start of last week. And what you would have seen over the weekend is now the online tutorial for academic writing has become live as well. So I'd encourage you guys to complete that as soon as you can this week. So we've got a tutorial activity there, the Word doc, and then there's the abstract in there which just supports you on task 3. So hopefully that should be pretty straightforward. I will be uploading a answer sheet for that tutorial over the coming days, so you can kind of check your answers against those. But also I'd be keen for that, the last activity, sorry, task 3 in that activity is writing your own abstract. So I'm kind of keen to get people to submit their abstracts to me as well via email, or if enough people are doing it, I'm happy to do it on the link of Leo as well. And then what I'd like to be able to do is provide some feedback on those. So I might record some videos or do some remarks or comments in Word, and just so everyone gets a little bit of feedback on their writing for that task as well. What you might also have noticed is that this morning what's become live is the descriptive stats module. Now this is where a little bit of a timing issue starts to come into play with this online version of Research and Ethics. So typically what we do in the face-to-face version is we would give you this week without any modules. So as you're probably aware, there's 10 content modules for this semester, and we have 12 weeks in the semester. So we don't have a content module in week 12 because you're doing your research project, finishing that off. You've got your competency exam as well. So there's quite a lot going on in week 12. So we try and give you a week off the content modules in the last week. This is usually the other week of semester where we give you a week off content modules, so you can do that extra preparation for the mid-semester exam. Now, the difficulty with that is that today we're going to talk a little bit more about, or recap again on research methodology, academic writing, but then most of you haven't completed the academic writing tutorial yet. So we do want to cover that next week on the video conference a little bit before you do your mid-semester exam. So my plan is to get that mid-semester exam live online for Wednesday next week. What that's going to do is if you sit an online exam Wednesday, Thursday, Friday next week, and you've got to do the content module that week as well, because we've not put one in this week, then it's going to make a pretty hectic week for you. So there's no real easy solution to that, but what we've decided to do is put the descriptive stats module online as of today, and you can probably read from that red text there that basically what that does is give you 2 weeks to complete it. So over the next 2 weeks, it's really up to you guys to manage both this content module, which isn't covered in the mid-semester exam, as well as your preparations for the mid-semester exam and completing the mid-semester exam online next week as well. So rather than just 1 week for the content module, you've got sort of those 2 major tasks over the next 2 weeks. Okay, so I might switch to you guys. Is there any questions on that? All right, does that make sense to everyone? Maybe just give me you can turn your video on and say yeah, or you can just give me a thumbs up if that makes sense to you guys. Cool. Is there any, anyone not understanding that, or any other questions and difficulties with that? No? Okay.
Just with the mid-semester exam, is there an allocated time on Wednesday, or is it just any time on Wednesday it needs to be
Yeah, good
completed?
question, Will. It's going to be any time. So I'm going to make it live on Wednesday. I think that what I'd like to do, I have to just finalize this with the other LICs around the country. But what I'd like to do is make it available from Wednesday to Sunday. So similar to your quizzes for the modules each week, have it open for a reasonably extended period of time. It might just be something like Wednesday to Friday, but ideally what I'd like to do is open it up from Wednesday to Sunday that week, and you can sit at any time you want. Obviously, if it's a face-to-face version, we would do this in class, which is kind of a nice way to manage it. But I think that trying to get a specific time for everyone to do it online just ends up causing a lot of difficulties. And I know our times are all that anyway, so it'd be nice to have a period where you can kind of do it in your own time. Does that make sense, Will?
Yeah, that's all good.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. So that's kind of the next couple of weeks doing, having a look at. So probably I'd encourage you to start having a look at the descriptive stats, knowing that it's not something in the mid-semester exam, but it is going to save you a bit of work and frantic sort of studying next week. So I'd probably, if it was me, I would be looking through the descriptive stats this week, just kind of casually making some notes, getting a bit ready for that, but then also using this week to really prepare and study for the mid-semester exam as best you can. And then next week, you're going to be in a pretty good position to complete that exam without too much more work, as well as go through and do the quiz for the descriptive stats module. It shouldn't take you a lot of time either. Okay, so just minimize that now. So I guess, as I've already mentioned, that's what I want to sort of cover today is those parallel sort of assessments that we're working towards. One is the mid-semester exam, and the other one is the group research project. So let's start with preparation for the mid-semester exam. As you know, we've got content from introduction, ethics, switch the modules in here. So from introduction to research, ethics and law, research methodology 1, research methodology 2, and academic writing, there's going to be content from all of those in the mid-semester exam. Obviously in class, we've already gone through some of the introduction and the ethics and law aspects, but I'd encourage you to look back on those. As I mentioned in class the other week, one of the questions that students tend to get or struggle the most on and miss out on some pretty sort of significant marks is some of the simple stuff from ethics and law. We're not going to ask you deep questions about ethical concepts, for example, but we are going to ask you some sort of question around ethics and law, the responsibility there, maybe something around plagiarism, maybe something around the key considerations from an ethical or legal perspective. So we went through those in class and had a bit of a systematic list. So look at the tutorial slides from that, look at the content. It should be fairly simple to answer if you've studied up on that material there. As we started to talk about last week, one of the other areas that people tend to find a bit more difficult or challenging in the mid-semester exam is the research methods concepts, and we can kind of treat them together now, research methodology 1 and 2. So what I've put together is a little bit of a dot point here. You'll be able to see hopefully the dot points I've got down here. So I think basically these ones here were all covered in research methods 1, and these all here are covered in research methods 2. You are going to get a question, at least one question on each of these dot points in your mid-semester exam. So remember, the mid-semester exam, you're going to get an abstract. It's a sort of 3 or 4 page abstract that you'll get, and it'll be randomized depending for every student. And then you'll have multiple choice questions, a few short answer questions, and the long answer question, which will be writing the conclusion paragraph. So that conclusion paragraph will be missing from the abstract. And so you'll get a question about the sample. It might be about the sample size. It might be about how the sampling was taken. Was it randomized? We know in exercise science there is no very rarely do we get pure random sampling, because we are asking for population or sample to volunteer for our studies. I'm going to ask you a question about, what was the dependent variable or variables. I'm going to ask you to identify independent variables, if there was any, the type of independent variable, if there was one, extraneous variables, whether they were controlled for or not controlled for. There's going to be a question around internal, external validity and the sort of the trade-off between those, the potential trade-off between those, or things that might actually benefit both internal and external validity, and so on throughout those. So what I want to do to kind of highlight some of those is to actually put this up alongside a little bit of an example that we can kind of work through together at the moment, just to kind of get us practicing and see where you guys are at with some of those concepts. So let me see here if I've got another doc prepared. Okay, so let's move that over there, move that over here. Okay, so I've got a bit of an example here set up. So let's say we're really interested in fitness post knee surgery. Okay, so this is not based on a real piece of research, although there's several studies out there in this area. But let's say that we as a group are interested in doing some research on fitness of patients post knee surgery. So let's say we got a sample of 120 patients, somewhere in the 6 to 12 months post. I've got hip there, knee surgery. We've got roughly 70 to 50 males aged 25 to 65 years old. Okay, so that's the sample. It's pretty straightforward what that is, and I probably won't give you, let's maybe skip that for now in terms of concepts. But let's work on the dependent variable. So if we're interested in the effect of, say, we're interested in fitness post knee surgery, what's something we could measure? Anyone chime in with that? Got the chat up here as well if you want to write in what you've got there. Harrison, any ideas? No? Can anyone at this stage kind of define for me what a dependent variable is?
What we're measuring in the study?
Yeah, it's probably one of the hardest things to define, to actually put words down as, but that's a pretty good one, Curtis, it's what we're measuring. Now, we might measure several things in a research study. Some call it maybe the outcome variable. So it's what we might measure to either compare groups across, or a measure that we might look for relationships with other variables, and then we have multiple dependent variables, but it's something that's the outcome that we're measuring. So what do you think might reflect fitness as a measure that we could use? Anyone want to chime in there?
Leg strength.
Yeah, okay. Leg strength. So that's a good one because it's nice and it's quite specific to, this is where my terrible spelling is going to come out live. So that's kind of specific to that thing that we know that they have a deficit of, and they're probably focusing on building up as well, is that leg strength. Yeah, so we might look at leg strength fitness. We could look at
flexibility.
Yeah. Something like endurance, maybe. So we could have measures of these different aspects specific to leg, but we could use a more general type of fitness measure. So maybe something like VO2 max. So we could sort of do any of these type of measures, right? Do you think our VO2 max would suffer over a period over where we're having a knee injury and surgery and recovering? Yes, no?
Yes, because your muscles will be fatigued because they're not doing anything post-op surgery pretty much.
Yeah, definitely. So we do see a lot of, we see research, or we're quite interested obviously in recovery and knee surgery of things specific to the leg, but we also know there's a whole range of other fitness aspects that suffer when we're either injured pre-surgery or post-surgery, because we're not going to be doing those demanding tasks that are going to, keep our cardio fitness or strength or power. All of those things are going to be reducing if we are not using them. So what do you think we might do if we had an independent variable, for example? What's something we might compare or compare two groups on? Any ideas?
The effective age, so comparing a younger age group to older age group and how well their fitness keeps up post-surgery.
Yeah, love it, Curtis. So that's a really good one. So age group, we could compare. So we're looking at fitness post-surgery between two different age groups, right? And we'd expect there might be some differences there. So we expect that maybe younger groups would recover, or their fitness levels might improve more over the recovery period, or quicker over the recovery period than older patients, yeah? What type of independent variable would that be? Active or attribute?
Attribute.
Attribute, yeah. Cool. Now, maybe someone else give me an example of an active independent variable that we could use in a study that's got a focus like this. What could we actually assign to different groups or control in some way?
Maybe something along the lines of like an active group and an unactive group in terms of like if they play sport or not, if they're like a casual runner versus a marathon runner, stuff like that.
Yeah, I love it. So, Will, that would be a really good active independent variable, yeah? So we could do, well, actually, the way you described it maybe could be active or attribute. I think that the way you described that, if they already are doing those things, that probably could be something that's attribute, but it also could be something that we actually dictate. So let's say that we give them a training program, yeah? Specific rehab training program. That would be an example of an active independent variable. So we would give one group, let's say a 12-week program, 6 months post-surgery, and then another group we would give no program, or maybe an education program, or leave them to whatever they're doing themselves. And then we could compare those two groups. So that would be an example of an active independent variable. So let's leave those as our examples for now, because we're probably going to, well, we are going to come back to those here. So let's look at the extraneous variables. So let's say that we're looking at VO2 max as a form of general fitness. We're comparing training programs that we've given. So we've given a training program and using a control group. What sort of things could affect VO2 max during recovery that are not, that is not my training program? Any ideas? Emma, did I hear something from you at all?
Would their diet have an impact?
Yeah, could do, for sure. And this is one of the things about extraneous variables. You don't really know for certain whether they're going to affect the outcome or the dependent variable or not. But if it's feasible that they could affect the dependent variable here, and it's not the independent variable, then it's an extraneous variable. So this could be a limitless sort of list here. So it could be diet. I know we've got age up here, but if we're just focusing on the training program, it could be age. It could be the severity of original injury. It could be the time post-surgery. It could be the level of prior fitness. Okay, so there could be any number of extraneous variables. Now, one of the things people get a little confused with is they think that extraneous variables are either controlled or not controlled. So extraneous variables are things that aren't controlled. Extraneous variable is everything that can affect your dependent variable. And it's either sometimes we control them, sometimes we don't. So we could, in this program, try and control for age. We might say, okay, we're only taking 25 to 40-year-olds, okay? Here we've got what I've outlined here is a pretty broad age group, but we're maybe only limiting it to 65 because then we know there's other extraneous variables that come into effect when we start dealing with people over 65. So there's a larger incidence of neuromuscular disease, of prior history of neurological decline during those years. So there's all sorts of other extraneous variables. So even controlling it to say 65 is an attempt to maybe control some of those extraneous variable or control the extraneous variable of age. So we may or may not control all of these. What would controlling these do to my internal or external validity? Let me know. So let's say we try to control for their diet. We controlled for the time post-surgery. So we made sure it was, pretty much 3 months post-surgery for everyone, and no different variety in that. Let's say that we controlled for the severity of the injury. So we said it was only ACL injuries. So if we started controlling for all those elements, the more we controlled for those extraneous variables, how would that affect my internal validity?
Increase.
Yeah, exactly. It would increase. Thanks, Curtis. So it increased my internal validity. What would it do? Well, I've got you, Curtis. What would it do to my internal validity?
Wait, say that again, sorry.
So it's increasing. So controlling more extraneous variables is increasing my internal validity. But what is it doing to my external validity?
Opposite. It's decreasing.
Yeah. So that's one of the examples of a trade-off that we have with internal external validity. So the extraneous variables, the more we control for them, the better we the more comfortable we are that there is a difference or no difference in our independent variable in that training program. So let's say that we see a significantly increased VO2 max with the group that had the training program, then we'd be more confident that it's the training program that's separating the two groups. But we would be less sure that that would actually work when we take away all those controls of external validity, because maybe the way that interacts with age or diet or any of the other things that we've restricted means that that effect kind of washes out in the general population. So it increases internal validity, decreases external validity, and the same the other way around. So the less that we control foreign extraneous variables, the more we can be confident it works in outside world, but the less we can be confident that it's actually that independent variable that is the key factor in that result. There are things, though, that increase both internal validity and external validity. So what can we do to our study to make sure that it has high internal and external validity? Any ideas?
Would applying it to a real world situation count?
Potentially, but that's probably again more of a trade-off. So it's not always the case, but when we try to apply it to a real-world problem or make it specific to, say, a training program that's out there or a particular group, we again tend to have a higher external validity. Usually, it might suffer on our internal validity. So I'll give you a bit of a freebie there, that what would affect both the same way is the sample. So if we, instead of 120 patients, if we had 1,000 patients, that would improve both our internal validity and our external validity. So sample, a greater sample, let's say. Okay, so sample is not a trade-off. The more sample we have, the more we can be confident that it applies to the outside world, and the more confident we can be that it's that our result is actually meaningful, or the variable that we're changing is the one that's influencing our outcome. So there are examples where affects, sample that affects both in the same direction, but then there's kind of these trade-off ones with extraneous variables. So that's internal, external validity. Limitations and delimitations. Well, maybe for the sake of time, we'll breeze through this one as well. Okay, maybe one quick question. Can anyone tell me what the difference is between a limitation and a delimitation? Maybe from someone who hasn't chimed in yet. Jess, Ella, Pat, maybe one of you guys? Difference between limitation and delimitation? Okay, so a limitation well, both limitation and delimitations are restrictions of the study. A delimitation is a chosen restriction of the study, and it comes back to examples of it often coming back to these extraneous variables. So the more that we control for our extraneous variables, we tend to count those as limitations of our research as well, but limitations towards the external validity. So if we control for age, for example, well, then it's limited. It's limited in terms of its applicability to other age groups. So it's increasing our internal validity, but we can count it as a delimitation. So delimitation is a chosen restriction of the study. Okay. So that's something that we might do in this study, for example, by controlling for extraneous variables. limitations are things that we don't necessarily have control over, or at least we haven't chosen ourselves. So maybe we've made a mistake or an oversight in the design that someone points out as a flaw. Well, that's a limitation. It might be something that we were restricted by. So maybe we could only get 20 participants instead of the 120 participants up here. Now that would be a limitation of the study. No one really chooses to or consciously chooses a lower number of participants, but if that was the only participants we could get, well then that would be a limitation of the study rather than a delimitation. Okay, so I mentioned last week that we're never going to ask you about nuanced views on the basic applied continuum of research, or the classification somewhere on the basic applied continuum, but we might frame it with examples. So let's say that we were using a specific training program that was very common in the rehab community, and so it was answering a specific question that trainers could use in the applied environment. So do you think that would be more basic or more applied? Feel free to shout it out or put it in the chat.
More applied.
More applied, yeah, nice one, Tom. So that would be an example of more applied. If it's addressing a direct question that we have, if it can be used by people in the outside world straight away, then it would be more applied, okay? So it depends on the focus, yeah? However, let's say we were looking at age group. So instead of training program, let's say we were looking at older versus younger patients and their VO2 max response to or during the recovery period of surgery. Do you think that's going to be answering an applied problem so much? Is that something that a clinician or patient can actually go away and do something about?
No.
No, yeah, you're right. So if it's not answering an applied question, that might be really important research to then inform our further research in that area or our understanding, so we can start to then define different training programs. But because it doesn't answer an immediate applied question or have an immediate applied application, then it's not really an applied research. It's probably more towards the basic end of the research there, okay? All right. So last few points here, qualitative or quantitative. If we're measuring VO2 max, would it be qualitative or quantitative?
Quantitative.
Say again?
Quantitative.
Quantitative, yeah, that's it. Okay. Now let's say we keep our age group independent variable. So we're comparing age groups. It's an attribute independent variable. What type of experimental or non-experimental? So remember, the subcategories are classic experimental, causal comparative experimental research, descriptive research, or correlational research. So which of those four?
Causal comparative research.
Yeah, causal comparative. Great. So if it's attribute independent variable, it's a causal comparative. Maybe we're just reporting. So let's say we didn't have an independent variable. Remember, not all research has it. So let's say we're looking at the VO2 max of 120 patients in the 6 to 12 months post knee surgery. So if we didn't have an independent variable at all, if we were just reporting on that VO2 max in that population, that might be really important information as a normative data set for people to compare their own fitness level or inform future research. But if we didn't have that independent variable, would it be descriptive, causal, correlational, or causal comparative, or classic experimental?
Descriptive.
Yeah, descriptive. Okay, so again, in the mid-semester exam, you're going to be asked these. So you're going to be asked about the dependent variable, if there's an independent variable, what type. You're going to be asked what category it falls into. So knowing that link between the independent variable and the subcategory of this research here is really key, okay? Instrument reliability, objectivity, and validity. And we mentioned last week that, again, we're not going to ask you specifically about one instrument and say, is it reliable, is it objective, is it valid? But we are going to sort of try to identify that you know all three of those areas. So let's say that we're taking VO2 max, okay? So we're measuring VO2 max on a machine that we know is going to be measuring the same outcome no matter who the tester is. So if we have a high tester, inter-tester, so different testers, the rating is very similar between them, would that be more identifying the reliability of the measure, the objectivity, or validity? So the difference between testers, what do you think?
Objectivity.
Yeah, objectivity, that's it. Okay, so objectivity is between testers, reliability is the same tester over and over again, okay, on different occasions, and validity is the measure testing what we're really trying to identify. And so we are going to be teasing out that in the mid-semester exam. The common research errors, so maybe let's go back and say we are looking at the training program. So we're giving one group a training program and we're giving one group well, let's say we've got three groups. We've got one group that's training program. We've got one group that's thinks they're getting a training program, but it's actually pretty low level. So we call that the placebo group. And then we would have another control group that is not getting any specific program at all. So what sort of common research errors do you think might come from that research? Any ideas? Maybe let's use the chat, because obviously there might be a few different examples there. So if you can hop onto the chat and maybe everyone could give one down that they know, and I can go through whether it's maybe exposed to that or not. Yeah, placebo effect. Thanks, Pat. That's a good one. So if we've got a placebo, then there could be a placebo effect. So that's what we'd probably want out of that design, why we might have three groups, because we want a true control group, we want a placebo group, and then we want an experimental group. Any others? So while you get those in, I'll write this down, placebo.
The Hawthorne effect.
Yeah, nice one. So Hawthorne is a nice freebie. I guess that's a good hint for the mid-semester exam. If you're asked to give one, then Hawthorne effect is pretty much going to be in every study in exercise science. So there are obviously studies out there sometimes where we covertly collect data and people don't know they're part of research. But ethically, that's well, it's very rare that that's allowed and very rare that that can be justified. So pretty much every research we do in exercise science is going to have the Hawthorne effect. So that's kind of a one that I'll asterisk, because you can pretty much use it if you've got any other ideas. So we've got the placebo effect, we've got Hawthorne effect. In this study, we might also have a John Henry effect, okay, or reverse John Henry effect. So these are when you have if people in the study know that they're up against something. So if we had a control group, for example, and they knew they were up against a group that was having a particular rehabilitation program, they might train really hard to actually outdo the experimental group. So, or it might be the reverse. They might give up. They might be like, well, you know, there's no use, you know, I know my fitness is going to go down compared to the experimental group, so I'm not even going to do any activity at all. So you might have the John Henry or reverse John Henry effect, Hawthorne, placebo. It's always open to post hoc effects, but that really depends on the write-up of the research and whether it's matching with the results. So the conclusions are matching with the results. So these are just some of the common research areas that are outlined in the content that you could sort of have with our mock study there. Okay, so I guess to summarize, all of these will come up in the mid-semester exam. So if you have an understanding of all those concepts, then the questions are all going to be fairly simple for you. But identifying those are tricky. So I'm sure there's still a couple of people maybe around the virtual room who are not 100% sure still maybe on some of these. So hopefully that started to identify the areas that maybe you're a little bit short on. So let's move on from research methods onto academic writing, which is the last aspect that's in your mid-semester exam. So if I minimize these. Okay. So one of the other questions we get is, what sort of questions will I get on academic writing? Now, it is a content, an area of content that we're going to ask questions on in the multiple choice questions and the short answer questions, but we're actually going to ask you to apply your academic writing skills in that conclusion paragraph as well. So remember, we're going to be asking questions that might be along the lines of, where in the study in an abstract would you expect the sample to be described? Can anyone shoot that to me through the chat, or just switch their mic on and yell it out? So what area of a research abstract do you think that the sample would be described?
Would be in the method.
Yeah, that's it. So samples described in the methods. So typically you're going to get things like the sample size, number of participants, the gender of participants, the age, height, weight, and anything else that might be relevant to the research outcomes. Where would we provide the aim in a research abstract?
Introduction.
That's it, introduction. And specifically at the end of the introduction, okay, typically the convention is. So what section would be the introduction? More specifically, if you're asked about it, then it would be the end of that introduction. What do we expect in the results section? I know that sounds pretty straightforward. Maybe what doesn't belong in the results section?
You don't want to talk about like the reasoning behind the data. It's more just pointing out specific points.
Exactly, yeah. So you might have studies that have a results and discussion section combined, and that's that those sort of results discussion sections have results integrated with what those results mean, the discussion about it. If you've just got a results section alone, then there's no room for discussion there. It is basically, you know, it's almost the, well, sometimes it is dot points, but more often it's just like a couple of paragraphs that read pretty much like dot points. Here are the results. It was outlined in this table or this graph here. This was tested against this, and this was the outcome of that statistical measure. Okay, so the results section is just the results. Where would you compare your results to the literature?
The discussion.
Yep. Okay, so literature you'll be introducing in the introduction, but then you'll be comparing that with your results in the discussion, okay? Kind of as a bit of a hint moving forward into the group research project as well, a lot of people think that you would write up a research paper in the order that it appears. So write the introduction first, and then the methods and the results and the discussion and the conclusion. More often it actually helps people to do it the reverse. So the conclusion is kind of the summary takeaway, you know, it's kind of almost like that elevator pitch, you know, 2-minute conversation with someone who's on their way out saying, okay, what did you find in your study? And so you've really got to condense the key points down into there. The discussion is, then you might sort of do, so you might write that first to really focus what the main points of your research outcome was. And then you might go back to the discussion and talk, you know, list the points that you're you think are worthwhile pointing out in terms of linking it to the literature, what that fits, what that means for the applied outcome or advancing theories, things like that. And then you've got your results that actually support what you're talking about in the discussion, the methods which set up the results, and then you've got your introduction, which then really can refine what you're actually talking about and setting up for the rest of the paper. So a lot of academics, and I think probably a good hint for you guys as well when you're writing these up in the coming months or two, is to actually write them backwards. Write the conclusion paragraph first and then go from there. So as I mentioned, the other aspect that we'll be asking for in the mid-semester exam is applying your academic writing to writing the conclusion paragraph. I think what will really help you there is the online tutorial activity for academic writing, which is online now. Task 2 and Task 3 both apply to conclusion specifically. So Task 2, you're rearranging some real conclusion paragraphs, but the sentences are muddled in terms of their order. And Task 3 is writing that conclusion. So without too many examples today, what I'd like to do, like I said, is for you guys to feel free to submit those to me, your attempts to me, compare it to what we'll have up in the answer sheet, so the real conclusion paragraph. But also what I'd like to do is when people are submitting those to me, just give me a yes or an indication that you're happy for that paragraph that you've submitted to be used in next week's video conference. What I'd like to do is next week, just before our mid-semester exams, I'd like to show you a couple of those conclusion paragraphs that people have been writing anonymously, and then get you guys to maybe in some smaller groups to get some feedback on those and some suggestions for improvement. Okay, so that's the other aspect that we'll practice and get individual feedback on, but we won't go through as a complete group today. And so that probably brings us to the conclusion of some of that preparing for the mid-semester exam. Does anyone have any questions about the mid-semester exam while we're still on?
How much time do we have to complete the mid-semester? As in, like when we start the exam, is it an hour long or 45 minutes?
Yeah, good question, Will. So we've been talking about in the national teaching team. I think 45 minutes is going to be a pretty reasonable time. We may end up giving you a little bit more. So I think it's going to probably be somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour. The idea certainly is not, I guess to give you a little info around that, obviously we have these discussions. The idea in this exam and a lot of exams that we give actually is not to put you under time pressure necessarily. And so I certainly don't want that in this exam, but the flip side is this will be an open book exam. So what we don't want to have, if we give no time limit or we give 2 hours or something or an hour and a half, then I think what it opens up to is people having all their notes prepared or basically looking up questions as they're doing the exam. So you want to limit the time a little bit so people are prepared before the exam and not doing that study during the exam. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Typically when we do it in class, it'll be pretty much the same between in class and online. Most people finish around the 35, 40-minute mark. Very few people will take more than 45 minutes. And yeah, if you're taking, up to an hour. So sometimes we usually make the time limit about 45, 50 minutes, or we've had some students maybe who've had special circumstances or whatever, we've given them a bit of a longer time. If you're taking, more than 50 minutes, then you're probably just really struggling or over-analyzing a certain aspect. So we'll give you the final details maybe through this week. We've got a version that we're working on behind the scenes online at the moment, so we should be finalizing that and doing it ourselves as well this week. But I think that, yeah, we'll give you a final answer on the timeline, so probably towards mid or end of this week. Any other questions on the mid-semester exam at all? Cool. So like I said, my aim is to have that available starting Wednesday next week. So we will have next week's video conference that you can ask any final questions about, and hopefully you'll be really well prepared, and I expect you guys all to do quite well in that one.